Hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to this, which is the 8th session of this semester's SunoikisisDC Digital Classics. The focus of this semester, as you'll be aware by now, is on digital approaches to cultural heritage. This session is on the subject of museum collection data, and in particular on the management and access to. And we're extremely fortunate to have speaking today Vicky Donnellan and Paula Granados García, both of whom work at the British Museum in different capacities. We will talk about different aspects of this topic, and then there'll be some discussion at the end and some presentation of a suggested exercise that you can try out. So just a quick note for those of you watching live, please use the live chat feature, which you'll find either to the right or below the video, to say hi, to ask any questions as we go along, and to join the discussion at the end. You can ask questions and make comments, and we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll bring any comments up to engage with them. If you want to get access to the supporting materials for this session, the outline, the readings, and the more detail about that suggested exercise, you can find a link to the SunoikisisDC session page, again, below the video in the video description. So I think that's all I need to say by way of introduction. I will hand over, actually I meant to put the title slide up as I was talking. But that's all I want to say, I think, now by way of introduction. I'm going to hand over to Vicky to give the first part of this presentation.
Okay, I'll just get my screen sorted. Hopefully you can see my slides now. So I'm Vicky Donnellan. I'm the catalogue manager at the British Museum, and that means that I'm not responsible for the entirety of the British Museum's collection database and all of its functions. There are a number of people who have shared responsibility, but my particular area is what we call the catalogue data, which is the slightly more detailed research-related information about the collections. So that will become clearer as I talk through my presentation. So as this has already been introduced, the session looks at data about museum collections and also how those can be presented online. To start from first principles, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about museums? So the definition used by the Museums Association, which is the professional membership organisation for UK museums, is museums enable people to explore collections for inspiration, learning and enjoyment. They're institutions that collect, safeguard and make accessible artefacts and specimens which they hold in trust for society. And art galleries are included in this, not just sort of historical collections. Now, of course, the word museum goes right back to the classical world, museion in Greek, meaning in general a place dedicated to the muses, the ancient Greek goddesses of literature and the arts. More specifically, it refers to the museion of Alexandria, which was more of a place of learning than a collection of objects. The collections, which are usually seen as the main precursor of modern-day museums, were the cabinets of curiosities, which were established from the 16th century onwards in Europe, like this example on the slide, the 17th century Museum of Physician Old Wern in Copenhagen. The collection of Hans Sloane, which was the founding collection of the British Museum, was a collection of this type. And very important to these early collectors was the project of classifying and understanding the world. Hans Sloane created numerous catalogues of his collection, and these are now studied alongside the objects. For example, in a project called Enlightenment Architectures, which some of you may be aware of. So these catalogues record the knowledge which makes the objects meaningful. Where does each object come from? What's each object made of? Who used it? And as public museums developed, so too did their systems of recording and organising this kind of knowledge and making it easier to retrieve relevant information through paper-based systems initially, such as museum accession registers, and physical card indices. And then, of course, in the latter part of the 20th century enters the computerized database system. And unsurprisingly, these have become the primary means of holding information about museum objects. And there's a plethora of specialized museum database software systems available. And I've just listed a few examples on the slide. There are way more. And it's important to note that even now, most museums do still have backlogs of objects that have not yet been entered on their computerized databases. And I'm sure that there are still many smaller museums which haven't actually been able to move to digital systems really at all, or certainly not to the kind of off-the-shelf the database systems listed here. But at the British Museum, since 2001, the digital catalogue has been considered the legal and definitive inventory of the collection. So when objects are acquired, they're no longer written laboriously into paper registers. They're just entered into the museum's computerized database system. And that gives a sense of the importance, the status of this data. And the importance of the information that museums record about their collections is also enshrined in the Professional Code of Ethics for UK museums. This is a screenshot of a page from the Museums Association's Code of Ethics. So if you see the point that I've highlighted, provide public access to and meaningful engagement with museums, collections, and information about collections without discrimination. And so that's enshrining the importance of our collections data. The BM, as might be expected for one of the biggest national museums, was a pretty early adopter of computerized systems. This is in many ways a huge benefit. We have all these years that have gone into what we're working with today, but it does also bring its challenges, as I think will become clear in this presentation. In the late 1970s, the ethnography department in particular began experimenting with a computer system in the hope of resolving discrepancies relating to that part of the collection. So this was a system called BMuse. Then in the 1980s, an impetus came from the government, who started wanting to audit the collections in national museums, perfectly reasonably asking what did these public museums have in their collections and did they know where all of it was. And as Anthony Griffiths puts it in his interesting article on the development of the British Museum collection online, which is on the session's reading list, I quote, Anthony says, "The then director had little choice but to reply that as soon as we had everything transferred to a database, we would be able to answer the question." So the question of, do you know what you've got and where it all is? So the process of trying to digitize all the paper registers, all the paper records thus began. At the start, the work was done by dedicated members of staff who were the only people who understood the early computer systems. Then in the late 80s, a system called Magus was introduced, and that system was more kind of user-friendly, and it made it possible for some of the curators to begin to work directly on the database themselves. And gradually data built up and the curators began to see the value, the use of this computerized information, and to sort of integrate work with it more thoroughly into their day-to-day work. And in the year 2000, another new and even more user-friendly system came along, which was Merlin. And that was still being used when I started at the museum in 2007, and it was still being used right up until 2017. And in that year, we upgraded to the current system, which is from the same supplier, SSL, but it's their updated product, Museum Index Plus, or MI Plus for short. And this is part of a wider suite of products, Collections Index Plus, which also includes an archives database system, Archives Index Plus, predictably, which the museum is on the point of introducing. And that'll be a great step forward towards integrating our museum objects with their related archives. So this slide shows what an object record looks like in MI Plus in the internal database view. The database is, of course, much more than just a list of what's in the museum's collection, that kind of inventory function that sort of was the original impetus for the creation of this system. It was really designed much more as a cataloguing system, even though that inventory function is one of its most important aspects. So you can see that each record holds information describing an object with potential to enter structured information in a whole range of different categories or database fields, whether that be relating to the physical nature of the object, the people, the places, and the events associated with the object, bibliographic references, curatorial comments, and so on and so forth. There are over 2.5 million records in the system today, and these represent over 4.5 million objects, because sometimes a number of objects are grouped into a single record. Over half of these records have at least one image of the object attached. The quality and extent of the information entered, though, is very variable across different records. Prints and drawings, like the one on the slide, tend to have quite rich and complete entries, as that department has dedicated a lot of time and resource to cataloguing its collections. Entries for objects in other departments can sometimes be more skeletal. They can hold much less data. And the activity, which we'll introduce later in this session, provides an opportunity to look at that kind of comparison. This slide gives an overview of the groups of information which can be entered into the database, onto the object records themselves, and also onto the procedure records, which are then linked to objects records. And that's when the objects are acquired, when they're loaned, when they're conserved, or when they're assessed by colleagues in scientific research. You can see that some of the categories of information of data describe the objects themselves. So this includes their materials, which would sit in the object section, their dimensions, their physical description, all that would be under object. Others are more obviously sort of administrative metadata. So such as the edit history, you see bottom right of the sort of greenish section, who last edited a particular field in a particular record. And other categories provide connections out to information which is recorded elsewhere. So, for example, under references and comments, we have the capacity to enter citations, bibliographic references. And many categories of information are controlled by terminologies, and these are also continually developed in-house. For example, capturing information about the people who made or collected or were otherwise associated with the objects. And this information sits in separate records within MI+. So you're seeing here the record for the individual who's pictured in this satirical print, Henry Peter Braun. The person authority alone holds well over 200,000 records for different people who might have given, sold, or had other relationships with an object in the collection, many of them with some level of biographical information, ideally dates of birth and death, nationality, professional, other kinds of status, so on and so forth, and a short biography. The British Museum developed its own in-house terminologies because certainly at the time that the museum began this cataloguing process back in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, and to some extent still today, there wasn't a single pre-existing terminology for most of the kind of categorizations we needed. So sort of existing terminologies such as the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, for example. So none of these had a sort of sufficient coverage for the huge range of types of collection that are held in the BM. Because of course we have archaeology, we have anthropological collections, fine and decorative art, numismatics, horology. All of these classes of material necessitate different classificatory systems, and a bespoke solution, I think, seemed to the people who were developing these systems at the time to be the only way to meet their needs. Of course, the reason to have controlled terminologies is to enable efficient retrieval of information. That's both for internal users of MI+, so colleagues within the museum, and also external users via Collection Online, which I'm going to talk about a bit more shortly. Controlled terminologies ensure consistency of data entry, and that in turn ensures consistency of data retrieval. So take, for example, the word teacup. You can write this three ways: T-cup, teacup all one word, or T-cup. Left to their own devices, three different cataloguers are likely to enter three different spellings. And then if someone searches for one spelling, they won't find the others in a standard free text search. So controlled terminologies allow us to determine the museum's preferred spelling and then also direct searches to that preferred spelling, so all the teacups are found. Now, I say this with this irritating proviso that this function isn't currently working properly on Collection Online. It's working within MI+, but not properly within Collection Online. And I'm very much hoping that it can be fixed to work properly online soon. So consistency is perhaps the most important principle that lies behind museum cataloguing. It's the word I find myself saying probably most often in my dealings with colleagues. Just make sure that you're consistent. What else guides museums in the way that we catalogue objects? There are established data standards, of course, both wider standards, which I'm sure you're well aware of, such as Dublin Core and CDOC-CRM. Also more locally specific standards, notably Spectrum for the UK museum sector, and that's also now used it in some other countries too. Museums and galleries which want to become accredited, which is the kind of industry standard for the UK museum sector, have to show that they're meeting certain minimum requirements, which are summed up in 9 primary Spectrum procedures, which are listed on the slide. There are an additional set of more kind of advisory procedures, making a total of 21 in all. And all of these come with a set of required units of information, which are for the museum's documentation of its objects and activities. So the data, the metadata that needs to be recorded in association with each of these procedures. And for my own work, the most relevant Spectrum procedure is the cataloguing procedure. So I'll return to this in a bit more detail shortly. But first, just to say that at the very local level, each museum will usually have its own internal guidance and procedures. So at the BM, these are stronger for some areas in terms of cataloguing guidance in some areas than others, but they're constantly being developed and improved. And these are just a sample of the guidelines that we have. We have very detailed guidelines for print cataloguing, for example, for the same reasons I mentioned before, that the sort of level of resource and effort that's gone into cataloguing those collections. And I recently developed a new set of guidelines for the cataloguing of casts and other kinds of replica. And these are perhaps an interesting case to look at in a little bit more detail. Replicas and casts are an interesting category of material in terms of cataloguing, because it's very easy for a cataloguer to slip from recording information about the replica to recording information about the original of which the replica is a copy. So there's been a tendency historically for cataloguers of casts and other kinds of replicas to really focus on information about the original object. But where the database record is for the cast, the primary metadata it contains should relate to the cast. Of course, it can also record the relationships with the original object, as long as it does so in a way that makes the nature of that information clear. I bring this up really to make a point more generally, that it's always vital to be clear on what it is you're recording. Similar sorts of confusions can arise between the metadata for digital images of physical collection items as compared with collection material that's born digital. And there's been a lot of work going on recently to hone documentation standards for digital collections in archives as well as museums. I should say this isn't a specialist area of mine, it's just to note that this has been happening. The BM database is an incredibly important resource for researchers, both inside the museum and externally. My own role sits alongside the research team in the BM's departmental structure, and that's in recognition of this close connection between cataloguing and research. So the data in MI+ underpins the British Museum collection online, and this is a major public face of the collection. It reaches a global audience, and it's often the main way that people around the world are able to access objects in our collection which are relevant to them, in a cycle that then enables further research, the results of which can then in turn enrich our catalogue records. This is how the internal record that I showed earlier appears on the website. It has a zoomable image. I should just mention that obviously there's a whole process that goes into copyright considerations for the images that we release online. I won't talk about that in any detail now, but it's something we could potentially return to. The records on Collection Online update nightly. So a change that a curator or another member of staff makes to a MI+ record internally today will become, in theory, available to see on Collection Online by tomorrow. though we have had some hitches recently, so that's why I say in theory. The latest version of Collection Online launched in 2020, early in the pandemic. And there were well over 4.3 million individual users of Collection Online in 2021, which is the last year I had data to hand for, from all across the globe. And this has increased from only 1.1 million users in 2017. Users can offer feedback on errors or other issues that they discover in records. And in 2021, the record-based feedback tool, there's also a kind of general feedback tool that gets fewer comments, but the record-based one received over 4,500 comments and questions. All of these come directly to me. I either deal with them myself if they're minor spelling errors or questions about search functionality, or I send them on to the relevant curatorial departments for attention if they're more about the content of the records. And this often results in improvements to the data. So in this way, our global users can contribute their knowledge about objects in the collection for the future users to then access. And this brings me to questions of openness. So firstly, how much data should and can we share? So there are, of course, some sensitive categories of information, such as valuations, storage locations, or personal details of people connected with the collections, which we can't safely or legally share. So these are, of course, held back. But the vast majority of the data from MI Plus is made available in the British Museum's Collection Online. And this was a decision taken when Collection Online was first developed in the early 2000s. In the kind of earliest period of digital documentation in museums, of course, these databases were developed for internal purposes only. And when the kind of use of the internet exploded and the value of making this information public became clear, decisions had to be made as to whether to let this internal data go live without checking it first, to let it go sort of warts and all, or whether to check it over, edit each record, make sure it was kind of right before publishing it. And different museums took different positions on this. The British Museum decided to publish without checking. Others, on the other hand, have a sort of pre-publication process, and they hold records back until they're kind of ticked and said to be ready to go. And again, Anthony Griffiths writes about that decision in the article on today's reading list. He talks about the sort of fundamental principle being that as a public collection, the information about it should also just be made public. No database record will ever be finished. As the statement here that appears about the database on our website says, the information is always evolving as time goes by. And questions of openness in cataloguing have been at the heart of some recent changes to the Spectrum cataloguing procedure. As you can see in this text from the Collections Trust website, the intention in this process was to emphasize the need to avoid kind of gatekeeping collections information. There were a series of consultations in which I took part, and the revised procedure was launched last year. Key points were to shift the focus of cataloguing from the needs of the museum to the needs of a variety of users, to be clear that information about collections might come from anywhere and anyone, and to dispel that idea of a sort of finished catalogue record. And you can see these goals reflected in the new definition of cataloguing that opens the new procedure, describing it as the ongoing process of recording and managing information about collections, often from multiple perspectives, to meet the needs of a range of users. And if our goal is to be inclusive in the information we record about our collections, we also need to engage seriously with the question of how we make our collections data as accessible as possible to, and more retrievable by, the communities who are interested in them, whoever they may be, in order to maximize the potential for fruitful collaboration and knowledge exchange. So as one means of enabling this, we're trying to gradually move towards integrating more indigenous and multilingual terminology into our controlled fields, so that people can find things using their own languages, their own preferred ways of speaking. One of the museum's curators, Alice Christoph, is currently working with a language advisory group from Hawaii, for example, to try to do just that. Another area we're looking at is whether we can add more sort of thematic categories to our structured fields, so that objects can be more effectively identified or tagged as being relevant to particular communities, such as disabled people or LGBTQ plus communities. Because historically, particular categories of information have tended to be prioritized. So, for example, art historical information. And the gaps in cataloguing can make it hard for people to find what they're looking for today. We also need to develop better ways to record the information that's supplied about the museum collections by people from outside the museum, better ways of clarifying who the author is of each piece of information that we hold in the database. This is all work in progress. It's not anything we quite have the answer to yet, but the intention is very much there. There's been interesting recent work highlighting how database structures can replicate and embed colonial and discriminatory modes of thinking. So, for example, the reading by Mike Jones on today's session list, and also the work of Hannah Turner. Many of the British Museum's MI Plus records were created up to 40 years ago, and they were often created based on historic written documentation. They therefore do include language which we would not prefer to use today. They include terms which are racist, sexist, or ableist. Obviously, when people across the world encounter such terms in our records, that can damage the trust they have in the British Museum. And this isn't, of course, a problem which is unique to the British Museum as an institution. Very many others face the same issues, and there's lots of work happening in this area across the sector. And as you see here, the Spectrum cataloguing procedure does now include a specific note about this. And the readings on the session list by Marika Kunst and Kathleen Lawther are good on this issue. A key point, as noted in Spectrum, is rather than erasing past museum practice or original historic information, make a transparent record of any changes and or provide appropriate context. That was quoting directly from the phrasing on the slide. Kind of our instincts, I think, as cataloguers, when you encounter a term in the record that is offensive, you tend to just want to correct it, to replace it with something more appropriate. And because the system at the BM doesn't automatically archive every change that's made to every field, it records that a change is made, but it doesn't record the previous data automatically. That means that there wouldn't be a trace that problematic description ever existed. And I think we need to think carefully about better ways of handling this. And this too is a work in progress. I mean, certainly when problematic language is part of an object, for example, a title printed on a satirical print or a caption, then it can't be erased. It's part of the object. And here, content warnings seem to be the best solution. At the moment, the BM has a generalized content warning in the online guide section of Collection Online, and we're working on trying to make this a bit more prominent and also to develop a more specific text to place on individual records where outdated and offensive terminology has been identified. Another strategy that's sometimes used is overlays on images. So the image can be sort of grayed out or covered over until the user acknowledges the content warning and clicks through. At the BM, we currently have this enabled for images of human remains and other kind of culturally sensitive images. The V&A, for example, has enabled it for wider categories of potentially offensive imagery or wording. All these final points point to the complexity of working with kind of complex digital systems which have been developed over decades and which are themselves grounded in centuries of paper documentation systems. So when you have 2.5 million existing records to deal with, any kind of change or review of information is a huge undertaking. Paula will be speaking from a very different perspective, that of starting a system from scratch. But just finally, before I hand over to Paula, one thing I haven't spoken about, but I wanted to just very quickly reference as a final point, is the additional challenge that's presented by the current impetus, well, the current, it's quite a long-standing impetus to connect data across and between collections. So when so many of us as institutions are working with our own in-house terminologies, our own in-house systems. Creating matches between them is a daunting task too, and it's one that's being investigated on a large scale at the moment by projects as part of the Towards a National Collection funding stream. Now, the British Museum is part of the Sloan Lab project, which is one of the Towards a National Collection projects. And I think the potential for increasing cross-collection linkage in the years to come is really exciting as well as challenging. And on that sort of hopeful and excited note, I will close and hand over to Paula.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky, for that brilliant presentation. So I think you can see my slides now. So I'm gonna start speaking. So the idea of my presentation basically is to talk about the same issues that Vicky has outlined, and specifically how museums' collections data can be managed and accessed in different ways. But I'm going to do it through I'm going to do that through the perspective of the Material Knowledge Program case study. So I'm currently the digital curator of the Endangered Material Knowledge Programme at the British Museum. And so the idea of my presentation is to show a different perspective of how things can be done when you have a bit more flexibility, and you don't depend so much on legacy data and all the issues that Vicky has listed.
This is a public announcement.
Sorry,
the galleries are now closed. Please begin making your way towards the exit. Thank you for your visit. Once again, this is a public announcement.
Sorry. So to discuss these issues, the idea is to look at them through the case study of the EMKP. So the Endangered Material Knowledge Programme was launched in 2018 with funds from Arcadia, a charitable fund of Lisbon Rosin and Peter Baldwin, and is hosted by the British Museum, and is more specifically the Department of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And what we do is to support projects to document material knowledge systems that are under threat or in danger of disappearing. And in doing so, we require these projects to produce detailed documentation or a detailed data set of the process and practices involved in the material knowledge systems that they apply to document. So in order to understand better what we mean by Endangered Material Knowledge Programme, I wanted to bring this record from Collections Online at the British Museum, which Vicky has already given us a really nice introduction of the sort of information that is recorded in these records. And so we can see on the left the image of the object, which is a regal pendant from the Asante Kingdom in Ghana. And we can see information about the object on the right side, which is regarding the title, production date, and also we can see some description of the production of the object, of how the object was made. However, just by reading this description, it's a bit difficult to understand or to grasp all the knowledge that is required to produce an object like this. All the material knowledge systems that surround the production of the object, and in which the object is also embedded and reused later on by the community. And so this is what we mean by material knowledge. EMKP defines material knowledge as the understanding of the resources, skills, technologies, and social values that are necessary to create and maintain the material world, encompassing the knowledge systems associated with the making, the use, and repurposing of material objects, spaces, architecture, performances, and environments. So is the system of knowledge, of local traditions, of social interactions that surround the production of the object and that have an impact in the object itself that we are interested in. So just to give you an overview, EMKP has funded 65 grants, 65 projects across the world in 44 different countries and in 4 different rounds of funding. And I encourage you to have a look at the website and the ongoing projects page, where you can see a lot of information about the different projects, what they are looking at, what they are documenting. Most of the projects are based in the Global South, but we recently funded a few projects in Europe as well. And it is really, really interesting to see the different knowledge systems documented, from boat building in Indonesia to show making in Slovenia, and other projects as well in South America, looking at pottery, looking at natural dyes, and many more. So it's really, really interesting if you can have a look at the website and see the different projects going on. And so, as I said, the idea of all these projects is to generate this documentation, this digital outputs that we are going to review and upload into an open access repository. And so hopefully I will show you a little clip of what we mean by digital outputs. But just to give you some overview, as I said, all records must be digital. They can be just more traditional digital media like audiovisual, audio, photographs, geospatial like maps, text, or other more complex technologies, let's say like 360, 3D model, virtual reality, augmented reality, and so on. And so for this, the program provides digital documentation training to help prepare for submission. We also provide training on ethnography documentation and on digital ethics and other themes that we think are useful and might be perhaps a bit more overviewed traditionally. So in a digital program like this, we try to support all these different aspects of the digital documentation project. And so after the outputs are generated, they must be deposited locally in the country of origin and then submitted for upload to us. And after a thorough review process, when we make sure that they are ready to go live, they are uploaded to an open access repository, and there are Creative Commons attribution, non-commercial share-alike license. And if you attended a session on intellectual property rights, which was I think 2 weeks ago with Andrea, you may be familiar already with what these licenses are. It's one of the Creative Commons licenses, and they basically provide a legal framework to share information in an open access way. And they can be more or less restricted. So just to give you a quick overview. And so hopefully this video will play just to give you an idea of the sort of outputs that we collect. I'm gonna move it a bit forward because I think so sorry, I had to cut it there, but you can enjoy this video in the repository. This is one of the documentaries that Tracy Peter-Samad recorded in Malaysia in her project about machete making in Serian. And this is a bit more like a documentary because they have a bit more editing in terms of audio, you know, and the different shots and how they move on. Not all the videos that we record at like this. Sometimes it's just much more like raw data, but this was just to give you an idea of the sort of digital outputs that we collect in the repository. And this is another example of one of the 3D models that we record as well. This one is a 3D model of the exterior of a chabu house in the village of Mashi in Ethiopia, and it is from Alfredo González Ruibal project. He's looking at the material culture of different communities in Ethiopia. And I really love this example because I think it really can give you a better idea of the textures of like the roof of the house and the walls. Alfredo, in one of the presentations, he was talking about like all the plastic containers that we can see in the outside of the house and how these used to be made with pumpkins, and now they have been exchanged by plastic. They are now using much more plastic, and so it's really interesting. And I think 3D model is a great way to get a much more immersive experience in the material culture, in the materiality of the objects and the documentation. And so. So basically, these were some examples of the kind of digital outputs that we collect, but the main goal of all this documentation, of all these different outputs, is to capture knowledge, to document material knowledge. So we are not so focused on the object itself, but in the production of the object, in the knowledge that is required to produce this object. How can we capture this? And this is one of the main things or the main issues that I think differ from what Vicky was talking about, because we are not interested in recording physical objects, but in capturing this knowledge. And as we know, knowledge is dynamic, is diverse, is non-verbalized, is embodied, and it changes. It's hard to document, it's hard to capture, and it can be tricky in terms of recording it digitally. We are using digital technologies because we think this is one of the best ways to document this knowledge, but it doesn't mean it's the best way. It's what we think can really help us understand and document these traditions, this local knowledge. And so in this sense, because we are capturing knowledge, and this knowledge changes and evolves, one of the things we have had to do from the beginning is to challenge traditional ontologies and reconsider them. And we need, in doing so, we had the flexibility to think differently about data and metadata and how to capture this information. So this, as I said, this is a digital program, and we work with digitally born collections that require a different perspective, because we work with digital outputs and also digital curation. So we care for the outputs to be published online, and then we need to make sure they remain there and they remain accessible. And so in this sense, another of the issues that Vicky was mentioning is in terms of the data and the metadata that we record of each of the objects. And perhaps if for the traditional museum, the data can be sometimes the object or the information that we have about the object itself. In this case, for us, the data is what we consider the assets. So the videos, the audio, the photographs that we collect, and then, or that the grantees collect. And then the metadata is all the information that we have about how that asset was produced. So who recorded it, why, how, when, who is represented in the asset, what's the practice or the technique or the material that is recorded. This is all that we consider metadata. And this is what I think is an interesting bit to reflect on, what we consider data or metadata, and it's also related to the audience, who we consider is going to be the audience of this information that we are going to be publishing, and in what sense they are going to be accessing it and reusing it. I think there is not a definite answer for this. It all depends on the use and the access of this information. And so, in this sense, because we are collecting data and metadata, and we are capturing information and knowledge, and therefore we are challenging traditional ontologies, and we are trying to create something more flexible, something that help us to be able to represent diversity better, because we are looking at local knowledge, local diversity. So to do this, we had the opportunity to think on a schema from scratch. We were looking at the schemas that were at the time available, but we were looking at schemas from museum collections and ethnography and anthropology, but they were all focusing on different aspects and not entirely on the idea of a project that documents the making process of a community. And therefore, we had to develop our own schema from scratch. And in this schema, we were thinking a lot about what metadata is, what metadata structure is appropriate for what kind of knowledge. And the goal was always to create a metadata schema that could be used more broadly than just EMKP, but perhaps in disciplines like ethnography and anthropology and material culture studies. And in order to do this, the intention was not just to capture general metadata, but also the socio-temporal spatial aspects of the practices, so the epistemologies of the communities. And so in this sense, the metadata schema is a fundamental tool for us to represent this diversity and to make sure that we can capture this diversity, which we keep working on. So this is a schema we are using now, but we are always open to feedback. We have conversations with the grantees, and we always have discussions on how to improve this and how to make it better. And so in order to capture all this information, we have different sections of the schema that allow us to introduce different sorts of information. So for example, the fields of technique and material come from a restricted vocabulary. That's the thesauri that are used by the British Museum, because we hope to reuse this information or merge our information with the museum database in the future. So we started to use the museum thesauri from the start to be used to reconcile our data set with the museum in the future. The blue fields are unrestricted vocabularies. So this means that we provide these vocabularies, but we allow the grantee to insert new terms if necessary, so that we can ensure consistency, but at the same time record new terms that are not available if necessary. There is also fields for multilingual information, because like Vicky said, we are also very invested in creating a multilingual record of documentation, so that different communities can search for the information in their languages, and so they can access those assets, looking for the terms that they identify them with, so that it's easier in that sense to have access. And finally, the last bit is the information that we record about rights and access. So this is all the fields that we use to record the author, the participants, the rights ownership, and the licenses with which these assets are going to be published online. And the last bit is the fields that are focusing on things like sensitivities or access restrictions, which I'm going to be talking about in the next slide a bit more. So from the very beginning of the project of EMKP, we have recognized that we wanted to have we needed to have the assets as open access. However, we have always recognized that open access brings its own issues, because as you all know, open access is a Western developed idea, it's a Western developed movement, and not every community is going to be willing to openly share every part of the cultural knowledge. And we acknowledge this, we understand this, and so we try to develop strategies that allow those communities to decide, or to first to acknowledge what open access is from the very beginning, and make sure that they feel confident with and comfortable with this term, and then different strategies for them to put certain restrictions over some assets that they may not want to share entirely. So another issue with open access is, for example, the issues with digital inequality, because as we all know, there is lack of infrastructure in certain places, and it's difficult, therefore, to access these open access materials. So these are all issues that we care for and that we keep in mind when considering open access. Same with cultural sensitivities that Vicky was talking about, in terms of how do we signpost this sensitive content, because we do have, we have assets of materials that can be considered sensitive by different cultures or in different places. Like, for example, animal sacrifice or other sort of content. So how do we signpost this? How do we make sure that the audience is aware that just to let them know that this sort of content is recorded in that project? And finally, how to establish procedures and mechanisms for reaction in terms of withdrawn or takedown policy. So this is connected to this idea of responsive archiving. So how do we make sure that we collect this feedback or these comments from the different users, but also whenever the community wants to take down any of the assets, how do we have procedures? We have procedures in place to investigate the asset and then take it down if we consider it is appropriate to do so. And then, so this responsive archiving is very framed within the FAIR and the CARE principles, and I think these principles have been somewhere, like they've been mentioned before in the sessions in this term, but basically the FAIR principles stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and they were developed with the idea of making information available, but a bit more related with the science discipline. So how to make and release scientific information for everybody to be able to build on and work on. However, they were not necessarily developed focusing on indigenous communities and indigenous practice, and therefore now there has been this movement that has developed the CARE principles as well, which stand for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And these are principles for indigenous data governance, and what they seek is to be able to use or publish data following the FAIR principles, but at the same time caring for the indigenous communities and allowing these communities to have access and control over the data. And these both are really kind of like the framework in which we try to develop our standards and in which we try to share our information from the beginning. And so all these that I've been, all these issues that we are considering from the scratch and are kind of like carefully embedded in the metadata schema and the data strategy that we have been developing. They all lead towards the generation of this repository, this open access repository that you can access from the EMKP website, which is largely a platform to share, host, and facilitate access to the assets in a practical, accessible, and flexible way. Although, as I said, whenever we try to make a platform as flexible as possible, there is always this tension in between technical operability and significance in terms of following the CARE and the FAIR principles. So it's always, I think, trying to understand this tension. How can I make this platform as flexible as possible, whereas at the same time being a platform where you can search across and using a robust metadata schema that allows for this information to be accessible. So the main requirements from the beginning were that we were able to provide quick access to high quality outputs at a public facing layer. So in a public facing level be able to access these high quality resources. while at the same time being able to represent alternative ontologies with multilingual metadata, but always taking care of intellectual property and data rights. And then finally, trying to always keep this framework of making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And then finally, I wanted to show you like kind of the next step, where we are looking ahead of working a bit more in. So we have seen that we have quite an interesting engagement, different audiences from across the world. We have had quite a few views and downloads from the repository. This is the website where you can access it. However, we're always working towards making the access easier for different audiences, different people, different communities. How can we provide better access and better responsive archiving, so to allow, like Vicky was saying, like feedbacks or getting in touch with us to make it a better platform, and giving access to the resources, especially to the communities of origin. And so I think that's it for me. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Paula, and thank you, Vicky. That's a really, really useful overview of all sorts of issues relating to cataloging and working with collections. I think there's a lot for us to think about. I've got lots of small questions. I think we should try and focus on the slightly bigger questions first. Maybe a reminder also to people watching live, please do use the live chat feature, even if it's just to say hi. Let us know you're there. Let us know what you thought about this. But also, if you have any questions, any comments, any feedback, would be delighted to see that as well. I think it's really interesting looking at the way the FAIR and the CARE principles interact with each other in these concepts. And I think in some ways what you're seeing is the FAIR principles are, you've decided to make your stuff open access and you want people to use it as much as possible. Here are some tips to make it as useful as possible and to make sure that people are going to use it, right? And the CARE principles are then an answer to the question, to quote from Jurassic Park, you've been so preoccupied with what you didn't stop to think if you should, right? And there are things like, let's actually think about, rather than just making everything as open access as possible, let's make sure that we're actually being a net good in the world rather than just throwing everything out there. And so it's all about stopping and thinking about all those various issues, not just technically how can this be as useful as possible, but whose use are we actually talking about? And that's incredibly important for all data, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. It does. Obviously, it's more important for contemporary data. It's more important for data where there are people or objects where there are people alive for whom this is important cultural content. But this sort of thing still matters if you're working with 3,000-year-old data. Where there are people, but there isn't anybody who currently considers this their culture. It's still important to stop and think, wait a minute, what aspects of this should we be recording? And that's really really useful reminder of that.
Yeah, I think both set of principles have emerged as a response to the needs at the time. So the FAIR principles emerged as a response to the need of sharing data as much as possible, making it accessible and usable and interoperable in a time that data was being made available, but in silos, in a very kind of close way. And so it was hard. We were putting data online, but in a very specific and hard to access way. And so once the data was made available, then we needed this sort of next level of ethics and thinking of whether we were doing the right thing or in the right way and looking after the right people, especially. And so that's how I think CARE principles came into play. Like, okay, we have the possibility to make the data available, but should we do it in this way and for all the different sorts of data? Yeah. And they are really useful because they really help you think on what you are doing and whether you are doing it the right way and the people you need to keep in mind at the time of sharing information. So yeah.
I guess it also makes you stop and think a bit about. We've seen from both your presentations, there's some kinds of data that it's important not to share, at least not in an unrestricted way without warning. But we also want that maybe also makes you think, what are we doing with this data? Why do we have this data in the first place if we're not supposed to be sharing it, especially as a public heritage institution? And there's some data, there's various obvious answers. There's your internal metadata and all sorts of personnel records and whatever else that shouldn't be public. But there's other kinds of data you think, why exactly are we embargoing something rather than just deciding not to collect it in the first place?
Yeah, well, I'll answer because we are the ones that provide the opportunity to embargo some of the assets. But I think in our case, most of the time we collect that data because the community is interested in keeping a record of that information. They want to document it. They want to make sure it won't be lost, but not necessarily open to everybody because there are these different types of access and community understandings of gender or age and the sort of people that would need to be given access to the information. So in principle, they want to record and document it, but not necessarily openly. But that's in our case why it's important for us to record this data, even though you need to think about these strategies and procedures to make sure it will be made available under the right principles and rules. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that with your project, you have that opportunity to interact directly now with the people who are editing this data. Whereas with the data, the objects that I'm working with, so often that opportunity, it's not there. So we're having to make assumptions, or we're having to think in a very sort of theoretical way about the duty of preservation, or what might motivate us to preserve something, even if we're not sharing imagery of it or whatever it may be. But so it's really interesting to have that contemporary perspective directly from the people who are depositing this information.
If I may, I have a general comment about this wonderful presentation, because at the beginning you mentioned the museum and the Greek origin of the word, of course. I'm sorry, I'm a classicist, and I love this comparison. And I think that we can see again, so a museum is a living collection and a living catalog. The two things are always strictly connected. Living collection in the sense that this is a never-ending process, and also in the past, as far as we know about of course, the famous Museum of Alexandria, but we have information about other museums in Greece as research centers, schools, etc. So any age is a living collection and a catalog. Today, in 2023, we feel overwhelmed by this huge amount of data and metadata we have to collect, but this is inevitable, of course, and this is, I think, the fascinating component of this work. So this is the same problem, and on the other side, the fact of collecting data about contemporary people and cultures, as in your case, Paula, is another aspect that we find in the past. For example, in the museum in Alexandria, the idea to represent the culture of the people in Egypt, and of course, there were other needs and other issues. The problem, the difference is in terms of accessibility, of course. At the time, accessibility was restricted. We know that, at least in our sources. Today, the dream, the effort is to open. But of course, we have problems on the other side, as you were mentioning before, Gabby. So what do we mean by open? How far do we want to go in terms of accessibility? Because if our dream and hope and effort is to reach everyone in the world, on the other side, of course, there are many limits, problem, issues, etc., etc. So my comment is very, very general, but I think this is the fascinating component of our work. Today is digital, tomorrow we don't know. Before yesterday we had other media, but still we have the same issues. And the fact that a museum is not just the museum as we consider today, a fixed collection of objects to visit and to see, but it's something more than that. And in the past, the museum was the research center with a library, with objects. We know that for Alexandria. So it was the research center for scholars working there. So producing knowledge, producing new papyri in that case, collecting objects for physics, for mathematics, for medicine, for philology also, etc., for architecture, etc. So I think so. This is the fascinating component. So it's a never-ending process, of course. When working on it, this creates many problems because I understand. So you are concretely working with data, and you have many issues, considering also that a museum is a public institution. So you have many relations with the people, the government, the country, etc. So anyway, a general comment so for this wonderful presentation. And the catalog, I think that the cataloging, I mean, I use this vague term, of course, but cataloging data is the complex thing. And today, of course, we have new possibilities, audios and videos. This is amazing, I mean. But again, how can we produce metadata? You mentioned that, Paula. So the difference between data and metadata in a video, for example. What do we consider data? What do we consider metadata?
And paradata. Now even like
exactly.
Now we have, like for EMPP, for example, we have the data, which will be the asset, the metadata, which is the information about the asset, and then what happens with the data that the asset generates after it is published in the repository, like in the afterlife of the asset. Would that be the paradata in terms of views, downloads, traffic, users, all this sort of thing, which is also very interesting and tells us a lot about the asset itself and its afterlife once it is released to the public.
I've been thinking, because in preparation for this discussion, I was trying to think about my own conception of data and metadata. And I think I tend to think of the data, because I'm so focused on the database, I tend to think of the main categories of information, the primary fields, as the data rather than the object as the data. But I think really, by most definitions of data and metadata, I ought to be thinking of the object as the data and the categories of information in the database as the metadata. But because my focus is that shift away, and I mean, I was trying to think, because I sort of feel about the database as though it's a sort of publication as well. It's a publication of the object. And if I was cataloging a book, the book would be the data. So, it depends where you're zooming into in this kind of process with how you kind of conceptualize these things, I think.
Yes, exactly. I agree on that. A database is a publication and is an interpretation in the end, because we can't avoid that. Of course, of course, we can have different perspectives on the same database, but is a publication, definitely. And then we can discuss about data and metadata as micro publications, because for every single interpretation, for example, also on a video or an ancient object that we are collecting in the catalog, in the database. So these are each entry in a database is a sort of micro publication, even when we think that we are just ingesting data from maybe a printed catalog or other information still. we interpret it.
And that's where authorship becomes really important. And I think we're not very good, personally, at the British Museum at acknowledging the authorship of catalogue records. They presented in a kind of like neutral kind of, as though they just appeared from the ether. There's not that sort of sense of an individual or a series of individuals overlaid over time have actually authored this information. And we could certainly do more.
Part of that is because you think of the authorship of a record or of a field in a record as the quintessential metadata. So it's not core data. It's something which is it's secondary, and therefore, I think this issue of what is data and what is metadata, that's you'll get a slightly different answer. And I think it's exactly right, Vicky. It's what you're focusing on, such that my sort of slightly I don't think anyone actually agrees with this, but my definition of the difference between metadata and data when you're talking about a museum catalogue is the data is the bits that you think your current audience are going to be interested in. So for the public version, it's the stuff that you make public, and the metadata is all the stuff that needs to be in there, but you don't think that people are actually currently interested in reading, and so it tends to be hidden. That's not quite what it is, but that does capture the question of focus that you talk about. So if we go back to the first session in this semester, we talked about text-bearing objects and recording text-bearing objects, and because this semester is not primarily focusing on text, we talk very much about text-bearing object, where the noun in that phrase is object rather than text. And so we did an exercise. My students will remember this, where I brought along an object which had some text on it, and this in my hand happens to be one of the objects I took along, and I said, describe the text, which there's one thing you can do. This is in case you can't see it. It's a pencil made out of newspaper, and up to another person I said, describe the object. And you get very different descriptions, and what is data and what is metadata in those two different records are two different things. And to talk about an ancient inscription, there used to be this separation in Epidoc, the encoding scheme we talked about in that session, between recording the text and recording the metadata, which was things like, what material is the object made of? What are the dimensions of the object? All things which, to the museum holding that is the core data, it's the primary data about that object. But to the person who's interested in the text, that's metadata. And so that's sort of that distinction, what you put first, what you actually want to show people, and what's sort of there in the background for completeness that scholars might occasionally want to consult and so forth. That's metadata, because it's not your primary, it'll never make it into the title of your record. And so the answer is not going to be the same for the two different people. For an art historian, the text, what the text says is very much metadata, because they're you might want to check, but it's seldom your primary focus.
That's an interesting point about text-bearing objects. I think the British Museum database is much better at describing representational objects than it is at describing objects that have text as their primary focus. So my colleagues that work with cuneiform inscriptions, for example, cuneiform tablets, they struggle with categorizing things how they wish to. That, we don't have a kind of content field, we have a subject field, which, we're lacking a kind of, descriptor for, if you want to summarize the content. And that's part of what we might look at when we're thinking about increasing the number of thematic categories, that whether we actually need to think more like, whether this will become really useful for the colleagues that are working with primarily textual objects. We have inscription fields where you can transcribe your full inscription, but if you don't want to transcribe the full inscription, if you want to sort of summarize what the content relates to, that's where the problem lies.
Right. Which, for the purposes of this discussion, and for the focus of the museum in most cases, it is an object.
Yes.
Primarily, right? So the noun in the phrase is object.
It's object.
You don't have texts in your collection. Some of your objects have texts on them, whereas the British, I don't know if this is if this is a completely fair distinction, but the British Library to some degree has texts in it, some of which may be on objects. Right? So they primarily describe the text, its author, its date, that sort of thing, and the update it's on may be in a slightly, less easy to find metadata-y part of the database.
I think the lines between the British Library and the British Museum are very blurry in many ways.
I'm massively simplifying, but that sort of distinction must hold to a certain degree.
Yeah. Monica,
well,
sorry.
I think that sorry, Vicky. I think that your definition, Gabby, highlights an important component of the museum, the relationship with the audience, with the public. I mean, we can find many definitions of a museum, etc., but this is important. So the object, so for the public to be displayed, to be seen by other people, of course, also for a library, but maybe even more than that. So the object to be displayed, especially today, where we want to open our collections for visitors, including then, of course, also online collections. And this is another interesting discussion, especially after the pandemic, where many collections became to be open for online exhibitions. So the relationship between the object and the public, the audience, the visitors. In the library, of course, the relationship between the object and the reader, the visitor again. So, again, we can have many different perspectives. But definitely for our discussion today, I think that this idea to consider data, so as what is displayed in the museum to be seen, I think this is how I interpret your definition, Gabby. One of the many possible. And I imagine that working on a catalog such as the British Museum catalog is difficult for this reason, but it's fascinating. So at the same time.
And I think talking about that key relationship with the public, that idea that I raised in my presentation about how do we better enable members of the public to bring their information into our catalogue. And at the moment that goes through a kind of control process via a member of staff. But are there better ways that we should be doing this in the future? Or should we be enabling more kind of citizen science, or should we be opening our, opening interpretation up and enabling people to directly contribute their own meanings and perspectives onto collections? Which is a whole other challenge, but something that I feel personally that we should be aiming to do. And I think the resources that a project like Paula's is producing are an enormously important way of enriching our records for museum objects with this whole extra level of meaning and the voices of people that are intimately connected with the objects. So I think that's, there's so much potential there as well.
Yeah, that's going to be really important, and that's also going to really highlight the absolute essential nature of authority and provenance of the data. Provenance is one of those fields which it's core data, right? Because for any collection, museum, library, archive, etc., art gallery, the provenance of the objects in your collection is something that's really important, and that's almost certainly core data, and some aspects of it may also be metadata, the finer details of that. But every single piece of data in there also has a provenance, and that's where we talk about authorship on fields, last updated date, what was the nature of this update, all this sort of information. But then what is the authority for this information? Who tells us that this thing was excavated in such and such a place, but must originally have been from Upper Egypt? What not only what is the authority for that, but what is the source of that information? What is the what is the nature of the assumptions or the deductions that went into that information, and that might involve pointing to bibliography, or it might involve trying to explain the arguments of that, or what sorts of information are more reliable than others. If something was bought on the private antiquities market, say, are we relying on the word of the auction catalogue for where this came from, or is there more better documented provenance for it than that? And what does documented mean in that context, and what does trusted mean, and what does authority mean? So all of these sort of things are then going to become really important things to apply that same degree of concern for provenance and authority to the data itself. If you're allowing any kind of intervention in the data from a citizen science or public engagement component, no matter how many times it's checked, you still need to be very, very clear about what's been put in by the curator, what's been put in by a citizen scientist, what's been put in by an automated process copying from Wikidata, what's, all these different things that are all really important sources of information. And not only where did they come from, how did they get there? How deep can you go in tracking the provenance of that data and the authorities for that? And I think that's, I'm thinking about some of the data that found its way into your place names work that was mentioned at a workshop that Vicky ran a couple of days ago. Some of that place name information and the disambiguation of place names was performed by artificial intelligence processes or machine learning processes. How do we document that now? Because that's a black box. We don't know how it came up with that name half the time, right? Because that's the point of artificial intelligence. It's no longer programmed.
Yeah.
I went much deeper down that rabbit hole than I.
No, but there is, for example, a provenance model. So in the Open Annotation Core metadata model, there is a provenance model, which is I experimented with that a few years ago for text, for annotating textual sources. But that's the thing, the provenance in general. Of course, ingesting this kind of data is complex because, again, the risk is to overload our data. So first, our research question, and then, but provenance is essential, it's fundamental. And today we can do that. And for a museum, what do we mean by provenance? Many, many different things, especially for an object coming, I don't know, from an archaeological site and then traveling in different collections and then obscure periods of time, as we know. So it's complex. Adding then the authority of the museum, the collection, and then the authority of the person who catalogs the object, and then going on, especially if we want to open, considering citizen science. This is something that in theory we can do that, but in practice is tough. But I agree, provenance, yeah, the key word.
I think the reality for so many museums is that they are still wrestling with inventory level documentation for, backlogs of collections that aren't digitized at all. So, you've got to balance these pragmatic considerations of what data do you prioritize at what time. And, the spectrum standards, etc., are very helpful with that in saying, for every museum, your decisions about the level of cataloguing you can undertake will be situation specific. But theoretically, these things are all things we should all be aiming for and working towards.
Yeah, absolutely. As I always tell my students, so for example, for a library catalog, a few decades ago, the library catalog was a piece of furniture in the library. We don't use it anymore, but we can see, I remember, I'm sure you remember that, and probably you use that. But this
still
is
have one right outside my office.
Yes, exactly. We have them in our libraries, and our students, they should visit them. They should try to understand the physical component, which is, of course, is useful to see those cards, and this is valid also for museum catalogs. But transferring those data from paper a card to a database is complex for many reasons that we know. But yeah, we don't have to forget that. We remember that, Paula, maybe you are younger than us, but anyway. But no, of course, now we have online catalogs, but this is another fundamental component we have to know.
Which, I mean, that's important to remember, but it's also, I think, really important to compare that, and we can take lessons from the sort of thing that Paula was talking about, where they don't have this legacy data, they don't have this card catalog to reinterpret, and to some degree, all of the information in a record about an endangered material knowledge process that goes into this is citizen science produced, right? Because it's not written by a curator; it's written by the contributors, and that's exactly what citizen science is. It's people out there who know things that we don't always. Putting that, so their own specialized information. So all of these things about what do we need to be careful about, what extra checks do we need, what's the provenance of the data, that's all already being absolutely core to everything that the DMKP are doing.
If I may make one more point, that is a very important point that I didn't actually say in my presentation but meant to, is that one of the most important things we can do, I think, as documentation professionals, cataloging professionals working now, is to record what it is we are doing so that the future knows. Because so often I find myself looking at the records of the past and thinking, why was this done like this? How were you classifying this? Why did you make this decision? And so I sort of try to vow to not leave people in the future asking that about my time. Whether I'll achieve that, I don't know.
No, this is fundamental, documenting your work,
Yeah.
which is time-consuming, extremely time-consuming.
Yeah.
Your decisions and your process, yeah.
And especially when any aspect of what you're doing is done using software that helps you to do it, there's all sorts of questions like, so I was talking to someone yesterday about documenting the process of turning a TIFF to a JPEG. It's like, well, that's fairly straightforward. There's 100 different pieces of software that will turn TIFF to a JPEG for you, but each one has certain settings, sort of assumed, and the button you press that says turn TIFF to JPEG, it brings up a dialog box on your computer screen, which has 30 settings, and you leave them all as default, and you just press convert. But actually what those settings are is useful for someone who's got the JPEG and they don't have the TIFF anymore, and they want to know what compression happened to get there, and so every single step, simple stuff like, do you have spell check turned on your catalog entry page? All those sorts of things are not that you necessarily need to keep that in a written diary, that you add, and I turned on spell check, and I but just have that record, that sort of information about the software recorded somewhere, I think is and again, ideal world, none of us have the time to do that for everything. But if you're trying to document everything, especially when we're doing stuff with software, especially when we're doing stuff with machine learning and AI software, what settings does it have? What has it been trained on? All that sort of information. When you're making 3D models, what camera was used? What compression was used? What level of accuracy did you expect the software to use? All those sorts of things. Did it do any surface smoothing? Which is really important if someone wants to use your model to analyze the object, for example. All of that really boring metadata that I'm never going to want to look at again, is part of it's part of how the data came to be. It's provenance.
Sorry to interrupt, but should we briefly explain the exercise, because we are running out of time and we forgot.
Thank you.
So we have outlined the exercise in the SunoikisisDC page, and it's all briefly explained. But basically, we are
zoom in on that, Paula?
Yes. Let me. Now, yeah.
One more.
One more.
Yeah, lovely.
So yeah, basically we have picked, well, Vicky has picked 2 objects from the British Museum collection online and 2 catalog records. One is a bit more complete, a very rich catalog record with relevant links, plenty of bibliographic references and history, and the other one is not. I won't say which one is which, but you should be able to find out very quickly. And so the idea is to compare both records and think about all these issues that we have brought up in the presentation, like what kind of information is recorded, if it is data or metadata, what information is missing, and who is the expected user for each of the records, and what information you think that should be included but is not there. And so basically how you could enrich these records further. And so these 2 links here are the catalog links for the objects. So if you click on them, you should be able to see the objects like this with all the information on the side. This is the first object, and this is the second one. And then we have also provided the links where you can download the data. So if you click in one of these links, it should take you to a page like this where you can download the results as a CSV file. So once you have downloaded the CSV file, we propose that you go into Google Spreadsheets and import that CSV file that you should be able to get from your downloads folder in the computer. So if you come here and you just import the data from a folder in your computer, you should be able to open it like this. You can select that the values are separated by commas, but normally Google Spreadsheets is very, very intuitive, and it quickly sees the type of data that you are importing and displays it for you. So this is the catalog record for the Discobolos, and here is all the information that it records. And so the idea is to think about all this stuff and ways in which you would like to enrich this data, or data that you think is missing and shouldn't be there, and should be there, and also reflect of this idea of data and metadata. And another feature that I was thinking that would be useful for you to learn or use if you don't know it already is the Wikipedia and Wikidata extensions for Google Spreadsheets. So if you don't have these installed already, you can get these from here, from the add-ons. So if you go in here and you go into get add-ons and you type in Wikipedia or Wikidata, Wikipedia and Wikidata tools here, you can download the extension and it will come up here. And so this means that they are already installed in my Google Spreadsheet, and you can also see the documentation of how they work. But basically, you can query Wikipedia and Wikidata straight from your Google Spreadsheet, and you can add information and links from them into your data. So for example, if I selected marble because it was an easy term that I could query for. So if I want to query marble, I can insert one column to the left, and in here I'm going to run the query on wiki. So if I type Wikidata, for example, Wikidata quit, it gives you the information here. So it returns the Wikidata quit of the corresponding Wikidata item. So if we click here and then select the cell and then close it, it's going to be querying Wikidata for this specific term. So if I go into Wikidata and search for that number, which is Q40861, Q40861. Yeah, here it is. It gives me the Wikidata entry for marble, so it gives me all the translations of the word marble and images, information, and a lot of more data that you may think that's useful. And you can do this with Wikidata or Wikipedia as well. And you can do this across all the different fields. I mean, if you do it with a text like this, it won't work because it is a lot of information that you can select specific terms that you want to search for, that you want to keep to find more information about. And obviously, I think this is a very useful tool, especially if you have a very large data set where you can just run the query across a column and you would get another whole column of text. For example, with the translations, if you want to translate your data set, this can be really useful. So this is the idea for you to kind of, I think if I go back to reflect about the two catalog records and the sort of data that's available and the data that's missing. And these are the ones that we propose, but if you want to also search the collection for other records that you want to reflect about, that's also possible, although you won't be able to download information because we provide the data here, but if you want to reflect about other records, I think that should be possible as well. So that's it from me. Vicky, do you want to add anything?
Cool, very cool. Yeah, no, that's a lot of fun. So yeah, we're looking at these catalog records, and we're thinking about all the questions that we've been talking about today. Where does the data come from? What data is missing? What data would be usefully connected to authorities? What subsets of the data would we consider metadata for particular audiences? And there may be different answers for different audiences. What aspects of data provenance are missing, or would we record in an ideal record? Let's say let's not necessarily criticize the data, but think about how we might want to structure the data in different ways. So yeah, very cool. That's a really exciting exercise, actually. Yeah. Fun.
Great.
Good. Cool. Well, thank you again both very much. This has been a really useful and really thought-provoking session, and I think there'll be a lot of discussion coming out of this later on. So thank you very much for your time, and it's definitely starting to get close to dinner time in yeah. So, cool. Thank you both very much, and yeah.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao. Good night. Bye. Bye.